Afternoon and welcome back to this panel session. I hope you have enjoyed the day so far. I've found it absolutely fascinating. And thank you all for remaining, of course, and not leaving, not Brexiting. This session is called Trust Me, I'm a Doctor, Trust Me, I'm a Patient, and Trust Us, We're a Regulator. And let me introduce the panel. I'm sure you know who many of them are anyway, but Dame Claire Marks, of course, the chair of the GMC. Saffron Cordery, who is Deputy Chief Executive of NHS Providers. Dr. Hal Jones, Independent Board Member, Board of Community Health Council, Wales. Dr. Folaran Majid-Kadumi, Chair of the National Association for Patient Participation, and Dr. Christopher Turner, Consultant in Emergency Medicine and Chair of Civility Saves Lives. We have a wide-ranging number of topics that we can cover, and I'm just going to quickly read you out some of the comments that were put after we asked you to put on the board outside, and we can pick up some of these themes during this panel session, and of course we want you to ask questions too. So here's one that says more support for colleagues, and a can do, can help, rather than obstructive or defending one's own corner culture. That was a big thought. How do we reinvigorate a pride in our profession? More kindness in healthcare. Reverse Bawa-Garba situation. We weren't quite sure what that one meant, but if you're in the room, you could perhaps elaborate. Promote flexible careers, more co-production of services with those on the receiving end, and we've done that. And then there are a couple of others that I will come to later. We were having a little debate before we got here, because as a journalist, I only see obviously the extreme ends of some of the cases, Bawa-Garba, of course, but with things like the Charlie Gard case and Alfie Evans, and one of the discussions that I've had subsequently is the role of the media and how important it is to be a responsible journalist in these cases, but also what was the role of the profession, and in particular what was the role of the regulator when it came to things like patient confidentiality and protecting staff who were being abused. So we might pick up some of that later, depending on whether they've agreed that I should ask that question. Probably the best question is, what have we got to learn from these extreme cases? Also, we want to talk about trust and level of trust in doctors. Doctors remain one of the trusted professions. A 2018 survey said 92% of people surveyed scored doctors as one of the most trusted professions, coming second after nurses. Can't even begin to think where journalists are on that one. Level of trust that doctors put in their patients. And we can have a discussion too about how much more patients Google before they get into the surgery, and how you deal with the feedback. And again, what is the regulator's role in fostering a trusting relationship between doctors and patients? There is so much to discuss, so I'm going to stop talking and let's go into part one. We've divided this up into three parts, but part one is, what are the factors at the basis of the public's confidence in the medical profession, and why have doctors remained one of the most trusted professions in history, but also how fragile is that trust? So let me start with you, and just, butt in if you need to.
Well, the whole question of trust in the profession is so much multifaceted. And the interesting things we were discussing earlier was in that survey, although there's a 90% level of confidence in doctors generally, we know from some of the issues that come into the regulator that there are some doctors who are totally untrustworthy for various reasons, and you will know that those are reported in the newspapers when that occurs. And in nearly every case, there is a combination of various elements, and that is something to do with either them being in some way lacking probity, in breaking the law, having their own health problems, which causes them to behave inappropriately or in an unprofessional manner, and very occasionally compared to that other group of patients, because they have not got the skills with which to deal with their patients. So I think that as a regulator, what we have been trying to do is to engage with the profession at an earlier stage and issue guidance to talk to them about the professional behaviours we expect, to make sure that people understand their duty to upskill themselves constantly, to only provide services for which they are qualified. And every day we take calls on our confidential helpline to try and guide both the public and doctors to ensure that the doctors have some good advice on what they should and shouldn't be doing in certain very difficult ethical situations, but also to take concerns from patients and to look at those concerns to try and maintain a trust between the profession and the public.
Do any of you want to comment on this? I mean, how successful do you think this is?
I think the one thing that we've got to be very careful about in terms of surveys like this is, when you say 92% of the public say that they have trust in doctors, that doesn't mean that 92% of doctors are trusted. Two things are very different because it's a survey of the public, not of doctors. So we've got to really look at both the micro and the macro level. And I think the challenge for doctors is to actually sort of say, well, where do I come in this? Am I trusted? Because not every doctor will be trusted. In every surgery up and down the country, if we look at primary care, today we will see a situation where, let's say Mrs. Jones has phoned up, wants to make an appointment, and the receptionist says, who would you like to see? I'd like to see Dr. Williams, please. Oh, Dr. Williams is available 2 weeks on Wednesday. Oh, I always see Dr. Williams. Oh, well, I can get you in to see Dr. Evans tomorrow afternoon if you like. Oh, Dr. Evans. Oh, right. I don't usually see Dr. Evans. Now, some of that may be a function of, Mrs. Jones's long-term care, that she feels comfortable with Dr. Williams. But it also may be a factor of, actually, she doesn't have confidence in Dr. Evans. And I think every doctor has really a responsibility to say, am I Dr. Evans or am I Dr. Williams? And how do I get that feedback to make sure that I can provide the best possible care to my patient? And that's a factor of a number of things. It's a factor of not just competency, but it's a factor of behavior. It's a factor of engagement. It's a factor of doing what the doctor says that they're going to do, whether they're going to write to a consultant in terms of follow-up, whether they're going to phone Mrs. Jones the next day and give us some results, or whatever it is. So actually, our behavior is crucially important to developing trust. And I think that needs to be a far more important element, both in terms of the education of doctors, the appointment of doctors, the validation of doctors, to decide what level of trust we have in those individuals, and how we perceive those individuals and whether they can actually do a better job than they're actually doing at that point in time.
You're nodding.
No, I mean, I agree with everything that Hugh has said, and I think just to build.
I told them not to do that.
But I would build on that with some additional information. So I think much of the trust that the general public have in doctors is something that is historical. I think often we interact with doctors when we are at the most vulnerable that we are likely to be in our lives, and we need to trust them for whatever course of treatment they prescribe to us or to our loved ones to be effective. But I think as we said before, we are entering into this information age now, and we're seeing where the relationship between doctors and patients are breaking down. That creates a vacuum, and that vacuum is being filled by information sources out on the internet, which aren't necessarily in the patient's best interest. So what I would say is that doctors are very much trusted, but that definite steps need to be taken to ensure that continues to be the case.
I'm interested to expand that out in a way about things like how you recruit and changes in the way you need to recruit doctors. And also we've talked a lot today about leadership and where leadership comes in. I mean, Saffron, you would...
Yeah, I think this is... What this raises in my mind is, yes, leadership, and I will come on to that in a moment, is absolutely critical. But it's also about the environment in which we're asking people to work. So you can, a patient will have a trusted relationship with their doctor if their doctor is in a situation to provide that continuity of care, to offer regular appointments when they need to offer them, to, if they're a consultant in a hospital, to be able to follow up as speedily as they would like to be able to follow up. But what we've got to recognise is that we are asking people to operate in an environment which is hugely pressured. It's always been the case that it's been pressured, but those pressures are increasing exponentially. So the pressure that we are putting everyone in a system means that we're really kind of operating it to breaking point to some extent. And I think that's where we aren't, as an NHS system as a whole, and I suppose as a political system in terms of the choices we choose to make about investing in the NHS, is we aren't giving everybody the best possible opportunity to be trusted, as well as recognising that at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who won't be trusted and who need to be regulated severely. So I think that, you know, it's really important to remember context in this. And what comes into my mind is there was a study done in the 60s about the level of kind of alienation and dehumanisation that started to happen in a very pressured ward, in the way that patients were treated in a ward, because the environment became more and more pressured. There was a bullying scenario within a hospital, became more and more pressured, and the behaviours were very dehumanising, which meant that compassion between a doctor and a nurse and the patient started to really erode. And I think that when you have structures and systems that are under huge pressure, asking for that trust and that compassion and all of those elements, the kindness that we expect to see within healthcare delivery starts to erode. And that's where we've got to look at the macro issues impacting on the micro. And then leadership, you asked about leadership. Leadership is absolutely critical in this. And leadership comes at all levels. Leadership is about what happens at the centre, what happens at the top level, and the behaviours that we are displaying at the top level and how they filter down. So if we have leaders who display bullying characteristics, then it's unsurprising that we will see bullying throughout an organisation. If we have kind and compassionate leaders, this isn't rocket science, then we will have cultures that emulate that to some extent. So I think absolutely leadership is a critical issue.
And comes in the civility that you have. In fact, you could probably explain a little bit about what civility saves lives is. Okay,
well, I shall in a second or two, but I'd start off by saying that I think trust is, in my day job, I'm an emergency medicine consultant, which I do on a more than full-time basis, and trust is the key component of what we do, what all of us in this room do with our patients. And we may be a room full of professionals, but we're also a room full of potential patients. We know what it means to have an interaction with a healthcare professional and how important it is that you feel that you can trust that person. So for me, that sits at the bottom. Trust is a really key component of a professional relationship. When you touch somebody else's body and they put their body in our hands and trust us to do the absolute best of them, particularly in things like when people have operations. Beyond that, I think there's a professional responsibility around sustaining trust in the profession. And that professional responsibility extends to how we talk about other professionals in the presence of patients. Now, we may not agree with what somebody else has done, but my guess is that any other professional had done what they thought was the right thing at that time. It may not look like the right thing now, but at that time it looked like the right thing. And remembering that allows us to not make comments about the quality of care that somebody else has given. It is determined by things like the amount of time that we have with patients, the amount of pressure that is going down through the system, and the behaviour of people around us. The civility saves lives stuff is basically trust and professionalism. It really matters how we treat each other when we work in teams. It is the prime determinant of how well team outcomes perform. It's how nice we are to each other. Nice is an ugly word. How respectful, how professional we are to each other.
There are some microphones, I think. Are there any people who want to make any comments on any of this before we go into the next bit? Yes, here is one. Just here. Oh. Thank you.
Ramesh Mehta from Bapio. We started talking about speaking up, so I'm going to speak up. We are talking about trust amongst doctors. Now the BME doctors refer to GMC, the numbers are much higher. It's very interesting that Hugh said Dr. Williams versus Dr. Evans. Could I say if it was Dr. Williams versus Dr. Patel or Dr. Khan, things would have been much different. The role of media here, so I'm going to actually challenge you, Victoria. I know, because, when there is a problem with a BME doctor, it's blown up hugely, and I must say that some newspapers are much worse than others. So I think it's very important, and trust is important, and trust depends also on the media, how doctors are projected in the media. So what do you think should be done where the media should be sensible, reasonable, and project right things?
I don't disagree with you. And just like the medical profession can't speak for every doctor or every nurse, I can't speak for every journalist. But one of the questions that we've been discussing with doctors and patient groups and parents post Charlie Gard and Alfie Evans is one, how you prevent it taking off, how you prevent the misreporting. Once you've discussed how you prevent the breakdown in the relationship in the first place. And one of the things that often happens is that sometimes it's the general news reporters who do the first bit of the reporting, and then it's when the health correspondents come in, we perhaps know a bit more about it. So that can change the dynamics. But I don't dispute that many times the media misreports or sensationalize it. I could never support it across the board. Yes, on the BME issue is very...
So we know that many more BME doctors get referred into our processes, and that is something that really we've been looking at very hard, this whole question of fairness, and we are doing some work on that at the moment. What we do know is that it is really important that people should be clear at a local level why those doctors are being referred in, and through our ELA group, the liaison officers in the local areas, there are discussions around why people are being sent in all the time, and one of the issues that they are taking into account is exactly this, because we know that many more BME doctors are being reported. My question, I suppose, really, is it that many fewer Caucasian doctors are being reported? I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's perhaps one of the unanswered questions that we have to think about.
I think it's absolutely critical. We know from work across the NHS that having that data is absolutely fundamental, and sharing that data and knowing what the data tells us, so about the level of referrals. And I know the GMC has been doing that work, as I was talked to about it, and I think it's so important. It's like the wider work that's going on around the workforce race equality standards. When you have the data, you can shine a light on the issue much more effectively. You know, you've got evidence-based, not just moral case, and I think the two go together here. It's absolutely, there's a moral case to say this is wrong when it's happening, but there is also the need to have that underpinning evidence-based to say, and we know it's happening, and we know it's happening because the numbers tell us, and we can look at that. And I think having that data and sharing that data, I know that the GMC is massively data rich in terms of all of the information that you have. So as much of that can be shared as possible is absolutely fundamental, because then you can debunk the myths or you can demonstrate that the myths are reality, depending on what you're looking at. I think it's critical.
Right, I'm going to move us on to part two. There was one green thing I didn't. Well, there are two actually. This one is duplication of forms and information, etc. About how can we improve things. And then there was stop Brexit, but I haven't quite worked out where that fits into this scenario. But I've just got to share it with you anyway. So part two is, what role does patient feedback have in shaping a doctor's work and supporting the doctor-patient relationship? And is there a role for the regulator in fostering a trusting relationship between doctors and patients? Now, one of the questions that has come in was, what about continuity? And in some ways, this comes back to what you were saying, Hugh, about that patients value it when they ring up or when they see the same doctor. And also when you have more and more multidisciplinary teams in perhaps your GP surgery or, you know, in trust hospitals now. What do you think about this?
I think, well, the first thing is, you know, we talk about feedback. I'm not just in the medical profession, but in, you know, in any sector, you know, you will have people talking about the importance of feedback, the importance of appraisal and whatever. Most people actually see that, if we're honest, as a bureaucratic exercise. Do they really value it? No, it's something that they've got to go through either to fill in a form or to do it once every year, to have a meeting with their boss or whatever. You know, if we're honest, that's why a lot of people do it. Yes, there are some people who genuinely value it, and that's the challenge for us, is how do we develop that culture where it's seen as something positive, not something negative, which is something that helps a patient at the end of the day or helps somebody to do their job actually better. We have a massive culture issue that we have to address here. Now, that means that we all have to take some responsibility for that. And we all have some responsibility in developing a culture which is much more open and which is much more honest. And that goes back to Saffron's point at the end of the day of leadership. It does require leadership from the top, and those that are in the most senior roles actually welcoming feedback. And welcoming feedback not just in terms of filling in a form, but having that open discussion. How do you think today went? What do you think? Could we have done something better? How do you think I performed? You know, what do we need to think about moving forward? Are there other options? That's the true meaning of feedback, not just how well did I do a particular job 6 months ago. So I think we have a real culture change that we have to address, and that really does have to start from the top, and it does have to start from the behaviours of leaders wherever those leaders are in positions of power.
Has this changed with the growth of patient participation, do you think, that patients are being listened more, the feedback is being listened to more?
That's a really good question, Victoria, and I don't get the sense from our members that they feel there has been a significant uptick in their involvement in co-creating or informing decision-making. And I don't say that to sort of throw stones at anyone present in the room, but it is interesting that we see quite often failures within the health service that are almost perfectly reproducible. They continue to happen.
Can you think of an example?
So a very good example is if you think of a frail elderly person. So typical scenario is a lady aged 75 years old, goes to the toilet in the middle of the night, she has a fall, she's lying on the floor maybe for about 4 hours. Her husband finds her, he calls up an ambulance, ambulance driver gets her, makes a cup of tea, she seems okay. There's no indication that she needs to go into hospital, but just to be sure, she ends up going into hospital. We know that elderly patients age 10 years for every 10 days in hospital. We know that they have to tell their story more than once because they might not have access to their notes, might not be cognizant of their personal experience. And within those stories, you get someone who was quite independent, had some sense of dignity, and you've taken them, you've made them institutionalized, and you've taken years off their life, all by individuals trying to do the right thing, but doing the wrong thing because the system itself incentivizes them to do the wrong thing. So that's what I mean.
Silos.
Yeah. But these stories they cycle through. I worked for a trust in Ipswich where there was a comment of, can someone write up a case study? And they said, there's no point, this happens every day. So, I mean, I guess that's where my argument is coming from, is that many of these things are already known. What it requires is action. So, and that's where we feel not enough progress has been made recently.
Did you want to add?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there's a couple of issues here. Patient feedback, all feedback is important. But there is a risk that it is sometimes weaponized, that feedback is used in a negative fashion with people, even though it might be positive feedback or something we can learn from. And there's a second part to this, which relates to the work done by Zenger Folkman on how we as leaders, as professionals, hear feedback. We have a choice. When the feedback comes to us, we can be either provers, which sounds like quite a cool thing to be a prover, but what provers do is they push back. They go into deny and defend and they tell you why you're wrong. Or you can be an improver. And improvers listen, absorb, and then they change in the future. But you can't do that in the moment. You can't just give somebody some negative feedback and then expect them to go, oh, okay, I'm going to change. You need to give people time and space to absorb it, to think about it, and to decide what the right thing to do is afterwards. And so often we give people feedback and we expect them to respond in the moment to that. It is a much more nuanced and sensitive issue, and we need to give people time and space to be the best versions of themselves.
That comes back actually to what Megan was saying this morning about these things take perseverance and patience and time, really. You were nodding.
Yeah, I think there's also something about, I think we are feedback rich, aren't we? We're always asked for feedback in everywhere. Unless we're going to act on that feedback, and unless we're going to demonstrate that we've acted on that feedback, and alongside that, unless people are going to feel the change that comes with that feedback, it starts, where can the trust be in that if no change comes from it? So I think that it's really fundamental that we find a way. It's what's that bridge between asking for the feedback, identifying what needs to be done, and then making sure that people know about it. And I think that there's something in there, thinking about the context of today and thinking about the GMC and the role of GMC. It's about, how much in terms of looking at the role of the GMC can there be those themes that emerge that can be played back at a broader level? Because what we've been hearing, I think, is that a lot of the issues of trust and trust breaking down are because people are working within a system that doesn't work. Therefore, how can we collectivise some of this and say, we've got this set of issues? The point about there's no point in collecting that case study because it happens every day. Well, if that's the case, then, we know that that's something that needs to be changed. So I just think there's something fundamental about looking at those patterns and themes that come when you're actually collecting so much feedback and information, whether that's from patients or whether it's from individuals making complaints about doctors, wherever it comes from. We need to act on it and act on it meaningfully, and find a way of acting on it that doesn't divert us from other elements of what we're trying to do. Because you can turn a lot into an industry, and I think we need to avoid that as well, because otherwise we're diverting really important resources away from where they need to be. So I think action is critical, but appropriate, proportionate action.
I suppose it's also about asking the right questions as
Yes.
well. So when you have the feedback, and I've always found the friends and family test really irritating.
Yeah.
Because when I took my daughter into hospital with a head injury, she had impeccable care except the CT scanner, who was really, really rude to us. But that wasn't anywhere there, that I could say this was great, but that CT scanner needs some civility training.
Can I So if I could just make a point, just picking up on what Saffron said, that there are problems with the system, as I said, and the way to solve those problems is to ask the people who access those services what they want from them.
Yeah.
And admittedly, you might say, I would say that, given my role as chair of the National Association for Patient Participation, but I believe that if we have patients being more active in designing the care that is delivered to them, it will enable them to achieve much better outcomes. It will make the work environment in which you all work that much more positive and encouraging. And crucially, it will also support addressing some of the financial constraints that we're currently seeing. But as I said, I just want to reinforce that requires engaging with patients and listening to what they have to say, hearing and responding.
And picking up on what Saffron was saying and the second part of this question, the role of the regulator, because sometimes I wonder if the regulator, if the GMC had seen itself even as having to foster that trusting relationship.
I think we see ourselves very much as being part of protecting patients by supporting doctors to deliver the best care. And it's a question of how you do that. Now, 25 years ago or so, I was clinical director in my department, and I saw every single one of the complaints letters, and I learnt so much. And the sadness is that most doctors, and indeed most of the healthcare staff, don't see those complaints letters. Very often they don't even come to the clinical director, they're somewhere else, because although, and we had this conversation about whether you repel the complaints or learn from them, every single one of those complaints is a perception for a patient. And for them, at a time when they're often incredibly vulnerable, it's really important the way they perceive the service that they are accessing. So I think we haven't got feedback right, and we know that if you give out a patient survey in my orthopaedic clinic or whatever, or when I used to have to give them out every year to get my patient feedback, the chances of anyone saying anything negative are pretty slim, aren't they? Because in that moment, there will be the very occasional patient who is dissatisfied, but the questions we're asking are probably not the right questions in that case. So I do think there's got to be a better way of feeding back, and probably in a more timely fashion rather than just once a year. There are some good websites around, like I Want Great Care, and that people have, but even there we see very little negative feedback. On the whole, patients are unlikely to give you the really useful feedback that will make you think sufficiently to change the way you're doing something. So I think we've got to be more creative with our patients in trying to work out how to get that feedback so that people can really understand how what they have been doing in that moment with their patient is perceived by the patient and can actually re-establish trust.
How do you think, there have been questions in the past about the GMC and about how slow perhaps it can be to respond to complaints, the time it takes to get letters out, whether patients even know that the GMC is about protecting patients.
Yeah.
How can that be dealt with? Whether that's a false perception or not, it is a perception.
So we are very aware of that, and one of the things we've been trying to do when we're looking at the 8,500 complaints about doctors every year, roughly 8,500 complaints, is to actually try and filter out those which do not require us to actually investigate further, so that we can actually look at them in a way and deal with those things within 60 days and actually get a response out. Now, I know 60 days seems a lot, but if you want to actually gain a certain modicum of information and make sure that you are giving people the right facts, it is important to have a timescale. So we have probably about 6,500 cases every year that we manage to look at and respond to within 60 days. I think one of the things we probably need to do more of when people actually report in is explain to them in a really better way what we can and we can't do, and also what their expectations might be. And we have developed a service for patients to actually even come in and have a conversation with us or ring us up and have a conversation with us so they can understand the process better and really be more aware of how they might be involved and what it means when their cases are being investigated. And it's not perfect, and we are really, and I think the Fitness to Practice team are really, really working hard and very focused on making this proportionate and timely and fair, both for the patients and for the doctor.
We did a survey last year of patients attending GP surgeries, and the feedback that we got was of three types. Firstly, about the behaviour of doctors, how a doctor would respond when you went in. The second type was about the management of the surgery itself, and the usual complaints about telephony and not being able to book appointments by email or anything else. And the third type was the relationship between primary and secondary care and how their case was being dealt with. But I think as individuals, what we have a responsibility to do in those circumstances is to say, what can I change? It's very easy to sort of say, oh, well, we can't do anything about it because it's high-level macro stuff. And some of it is, but some of it is about us personally as well. And one of my favorite quotes is from Leo Tolstoy. And Tolstoy said, everybody thinks of changing the world, but nobody thinks of changing himself. And I think that's actually quite crucial, that we actually look at ourselves and say, how can I do this better? And everybody, I would hope, would go away from this conference and say, that's what I want to do, and to do that on a daily basis.
Are there any comments out here, any observations that you, yes, here? And there's one over there as well. And another one. Yeah,
I'm going to make these comments in very good faith. My observation in recent years about the famous cases General Medical Council has dealt with is this: a regulatory authority must be a competent authority. And as a result, it should be able to tell the right from the wrong. And as a doctor, and General Medical Council as a regulatory authority has continuously failed to tell right from the wrong. As far as the technical details and technicalities of the medicine are concerned, the most recent case of Baba Garba, there were technicalities. I won't go into that. I won't refer to any single case. But I know of lots of cases which could have been decided in a very different way, where the General Medical Council would come across as a very reliable authority, whereas the case is very different. So GMC, why, I very briefly tell you that what I think that GMC can do to improve this technical side of the medicine. GMC has got the lay member, and GMC has got the qualified doctor like our chair is. Medicine is a technical thing, it's not a lay thing. And I will not be I won't be treated by a lay member of the public. I want a doctor, and I want a very good doctor on my bedside once I'm unwell. The reason GMC has failed in technicality is that they use one case examiner, they use one case expert, and they take their word as a final, and they wouldn't budge from there. In the past, until 2000, we had 140 members elected from the profession, and as per statutes and the 1983 Medical Act, with 6 recommendations until 2016, 7 committees which GMC makes to make its own rule. Probably most of the doctors don't know that the GMC has been given the statutes to make its own rule. Those doctors used to sit on the committees, and the safety of review was much, much higher.
Okay,
and
can
suggestion...
I just stop there? I think, do you want to respond to that there? And then there's a question over there and a question down here as well. Is there another, are there two, so there's one over there with her hand up there, and is there another microphone just so we can speed it up? Sorry to interrupt you.
So very briefly.
Hello.
Oh, hang on a sec. We'll just answer this question first.
Very briefly, the mission of the GMC is to protect the public by working with doctors to provide great care. And I think that the way we do that is through our statutes. The council does indeed have 6 lay members who represent the public. I would like to think that every single doctor, the 6 doctors, also represent the patients, and we are all focused, all of us, on trying to improve the way in which we support doctors to deliver great care. And I think that's probably all I want to say.
Yes, and there's over here. Oh, sorry, I was pointing actually at the woman with the pink jumper on behind you. But if you yes.
Hello, actually this question is about the feedback for the doctors from the patients. Here I want to say, for my whole life I have done since this started feedback system, but here the question is, I feel sorry for the patients. They have participated in the feedback, but the organization, it is not their result, what services have been improved, how it doesn't go to the patients. For example, if I do 30 to 35 patients, revalidation 5 year or even every year, but honestly, people have participated after leaving my clinic, but at the end of the day, what I find after few months, the organization has not returned to the patients or my head of the department that what was the outcome of your complaint. These improvements have been made by our organization because of your feedback. In good way, we have done this so that in that way it reflects that the patients are being sort of respected, their feedback is being taken into consideration seriously, so it builds a more trust with the patient and the doctor. I think it's not happening. I don't know how to improve this system, why the organization doesn't convey these messages to the patients who participated. I'm not sort of finding that situation.
Okay, and we have a question here, and then over there. Yes.
Hello, I'm Patricia Wilkie, President of the National Association for Patient Participation. Thank you for an interesting discussion. Patients have long known that continuity of care is important, but nobody has believed us. Last year, the BMJ published a letter, an article, June 2018, by Pereira Gray, demonstrating that with continuity, mortality is improved. Feedback from patients is important, but it is important that the public know why feedback is important. NAP can help in publicising this through our millions of members and the questions that should be asked.
That is an extremely interesting point. Do you want to pick that up and then we will come here? I mean...
Well, I think any organisation that asks for something should respond in terms of you said, we did. Mm-hmm. That's the simple response. And anybody who doesn't do that is actually going to be open to criticism, because people are going to say, well, I've mentioned all these things, but people don't take any notice.
And also back to the doctors themselves. So it's 360 degrees. Claire, did you want to?
I thought that was a really good point, and the public on the whole don't know what we do with the feedback, and it's fair to say that because it's anonymous, it's quite difficult for people to be told about how it is. But I mean, one can be creative. So in an organisation, it wouldn't be beyond the wit of man to have a board that says, these were some of the things that we received in feedback, and these are some of the things we did about it. So, I mean, that's a managerial leadership thing, and maybe we need to think about that in the GMC. So,
sorry,
Charlie.
I'm going to throw a cat amongst the pigeons now and say that actually, in my experience, patient feedback, the sort of patient feedback that I've been involved with, always has had a response. I think it's very positive. I'm just jotted down a few examples. For example, the carers' passports, which are now being put into most hospitals, that was as a result of patient feedback. The Dementia Handbook for Carers and Care Providers, which is a superb publication, which is now an app, that was as a result of patient feedback. If you even take Kate Granger, who admittedly she was a doctor, but her feedback as a patient was responsible for the hello, my name is. So patient feedback does get listened to, and patient feedback isn't always negative. Let's make sure about that. Patient feedback sometimes is about saying there are things that could be improved, and we think that this is one way that perhaps it could be done. I'm a passionate believer in co-production and patient involvement, and it's something that I will continue to campaign for. But as far as feedback goes, let me just give you an example. Just have a little think. When you go into a hospital, do you have a clue where the PALS office is? Do you know where in the hospital you go to if you have a complaint that you want to lodge? If anybody in this room can say, yep, I know exactly where it is, then good for you, because you'll be in the minority. And the other thing is that when you give patient feedback through the PALS complaint system, I've known people who've come to me and said, but I rang up and they told me I'd got to put it in writing. So I've said, well, send them an email. And then I've had another phone call saying I've sent an email and they've sent me a letter saying that I need to put it in writing. There's one hospital where one of the nurses, after patient feedback, thought, one of the senior nurses, actually moved the PALS office from the back of Beyond to put it in the main corridor, so that everybody, and that's Frimley, so everybody knows where it is. And the thing is that it reduced the number of complaints that went through to written and, very emotional, because people could walk in and say, look, I've just noticed so-and-so with, my mother's care or my father's care or whatever, and it's been dealt with quickly and it's been done. So patient feedback's great, but we have to know how to get it, and then we have to know how to use it.
I'm going to interrupt you now because we need to go on to the next, to the next session, but I think this follows on very nicely from those points that you've made, is what trust do doctors, patients and the general public put in the GMC, and what can the GMC do to improve this? And I want to read out one of the comments that was sent in to us. When introducing the report into the Gosport Memorial Hospital, Jeremy Hunt said, if a family feel that an injustice has been done, who can they go to if they feel that ranks are being closed? A good question, and one that remains unanswered. Is the GMC taking measures to address this question? So let me come to you first, Claire.
Well, thank you for that question. In fact, the GMC is doing really quite a lot on this sort of space. We have got a confidential helpline that can also be anonymous for concerns to be expressed about doctors. More than that, we take a whole lot of concerns which actually are not around doctors, but where people don't know where to go. And we work with other regulators to make sure that we signpost them appropriately to the right place to go. I think it's really important for people to understand that when we do get complaints about doctors, we do look at them all. And the first thing we do is to go back to the local environment and actually have conversations with the local responsible officer around that doctor, so that even if it is an issue that does not pass the threshold for GMC investigation, there is knowledge about what is going on at the local level by the responsible officer, and sometimes there can be support or conversations that are made locally in order to help that doctor improve their practice. So I think there are some really good mechanisms now that we're putting in place in order to progress exactly these sort of issues where people are concerned that they are not being heard in the first instance at a local level.
I mean, just going back to this Gosport question, there was that doctor in that. In Gosport did come before a GMC panel, and there was a feeling once the report was out that hadn't been dealt with fairly. Is that historic? That wouldn't happen now? It would be dealt with in a very different way?
So the process of fitness to practice has been upgraded as time goes by, but what I can tell you is that the Medical Practitioners Tribunal Service is completely independent. It is run very expeditiously by Dame Caroline Swift, who has improved the timings of the hearings, and now all the hearings have legally qualified chairs, as well as the individuals who sit on those fitness to practice panels. So I think that the processes are fundamentally about deciding future fitness to practice, and therein lies the issue. They are not punitive panels. They are there to ensure that if that doctor remains on the register, they are fit to carry out the practice, and if there are other sanctions aside from that. People, I think, often think that the GMC is there to actually punish doctors. That is not where we stand. We are talking about their future fitness to practice.
Saffron, you wanted to?
Yeah, just thinking around this issue about trust, actually, and I think that it's really important that we think about individual doctors. So we think about Gosport or wherever, and we think about individual doctors, but I think there's something also really important about thinking about the role of the employing organisation as well in this, so that people see that there's kind of a twofold route, really. There's something about the responsibility of the employing organisation and the responsibility of the individual and the professional regulator to which it's responsible, etc. And I think healthcare is immensely complex, but picking our way through this, we have to remember that in its complexity, there are also lots of, I was going to say backstop, but that says Brexit, doesn't it? But, there are lots of safeguards potentially there. And I think the role of the GMC, the SRO in the local trust, and then the role of the trust as well is absolutely fundamental. So how a trust responds, as well as how the GMC responds, is really important. So that's what I would say in terms of our member organisations, how they respond to these incidents is also very important.
Even down to not putting the Powell's office at the very back of the hospital.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
Were going to say...
Sorry, I'm done.
Sorry.
Yeah, I finished.
Yeah, so we swim in the left-shifted part of the behavioural curve. We look at the negatives, we draw on those, and we try and learn from them. But in terms of the feedback that you're talking about, there's also positive feedback that's out there that is not being heard. Now, we, as doctors, aspire to being the best that we can possibly be. There is a growing body of evidence that not just looking at the negative stuff, but actually looking at the positive stuff and trying to learn from that leads to really significant improvements in patient care. And there's a chap called Adrian Plunkett in Birmingham Children's who runs something called Learning from Excellence. And they have a project called Praise. And in Praise, all they did was they told people when they did really good prescriptions. And they didn't chase after people and chasing the negative. They just told people the good stuff. And we, as medical professionals, respond very well to that. We don't respond brilliantly to being beaten up, but we respond very well to looking at the good, the excellent, and being shown what that looks like. And I think there's a space in this to help people to reflect back the good stuff, and also to make sure that as well as listening to and learning from the bad stuff, we're listening to and learning from that good stuff too.
But what do you think Folarin do? I mean, because the patient participation can sometimes, I assume, become slightly skewed into the these are the problems.
No, I think Chris makes a very good point that there are good stories out there, and where there has been excellence in practice, it's something that the wider system itself can benefit from hearing about. But I guess just going back to something that you said, and also the lady over there with the fuchsia jumper, or magenta jumper, it was around the fact that feedback is solicited and some of that feedback is good. But what we easily identify is there are a lot of individuals who are not engaged in that process, a lot of patients who can't make their voice heard. And therefore, if we are saying that the feedback that we're getting is good, we could consider that to be almost preaching to the converted. What we want to do is to identify those elements of society that are the most vulnerable, the least listened to, those who are traditionally the highest consumers of healthcare resources, and making sure that their voices are heard. And when they say good things, acting on that, but also being very responsive to some of the negative things they have to say. And currently, despite everything I've heard today, I've not heard enough about how we're going to engage those people who have traditionally not been engaged in the co-design or even the delivery of services for their benefits.
I think there's a comment there. We haven't got very much time, so if you could keep it pithy.
Yeah. So I have two questions, just quick one. So, I mean, if... first one, I think if GMC gets... if a doctor is being referred to GMC, and I think it comes out to be true, how do they encourage no-blame culture, or, I mean, project on the part of doctor, and how do they support the trust to carry out a no-blame culture?
Oh,
then two...
one, because there's one here, and we really are running out of time.
So very briefly, we are very aware of the systems pressures around doctors at the moment, and all our case examiners are going to receive training in human factors, and we will be taking that into account so that when we're assessing someone's case, we will actually also be looking at and that is in an attempt to try to ensure that only those things that truly are within the purview of the doctor are actually being considered, or if indeed we do have to take into account everything, that we understand what those external pressures are in an attempt to make the culture in the system that we run more just. I mean, it's a much greater, it's a really important question, and not in
a big question.
A big, big question.
I apologise, I just realised I was being scary after all we heard this morning. One question here.
Yeah.
Yep, go.
Hear me now? Yeah, I've got some negative feedback for you. In 2012, I stumbled across an attempt to murder my mother through the misuse of the Liverpool care pathway. And eventually I lodged a complaint to the GMC against the doctors involved on two grounds: communication and the care given to my mother. And the fitness to practice people rejected my complaint. Many doctors had actually investigated it, and they concluded that the communication with me and my family was suboptimal. When they dismissed my complaint, the GMC said that the care was above that expected of a consultant practicing medicine in the UK. And when it came to the care given to my mother, the prognosis was she had weeks to live. And various doctors investigated my complaint, and they all concluded that it was incorrect to place my mother on the LCP, as she had much more than 2 or 3 days to live. And again, the GMC, when they rejected my complaint, they said the care given to my mother was above that expected of a doctor practicing medicine in the UK. When a patient gets this sort of feedback from a really legitimate complaint, how can the public have any real trust in the GMC?
First thing to say is I'm very sorry that you found the care that your mother received was inadequate. I obviously can't answer that particular specific question, but the generality is a good point. And what we try to do is ensure that our case examiners actually understand the entire circumstances surrounding that patient. And we have done a lot of work since 2012. It will probably never be perfect, but we are really, really concentrating and working on that.
I'm sorry I have to bring this to an end, but I promised to keep this to time, and I'm sure that there are many more questions that you want to ask, but can I ask you to thank the panel for their observations and for their answers? And we are very nearly at an end, but don't go because there is still more to come. While the panel sneaks off the stage, no, not sneaks, just walks with pride off the stage, can I please ask Charlie Massey, who is Chief Executive of the GMC, to come and address you. Thank you. Whoops. Sorry, we needed this pulled.
There we go.
Furniture remover and chair.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Victoria. It's great to be here. The privilege of having the last comments is that I only have my scrawled note through the day to look through. Realised as an increasingly middle-aged man, the thing has increasingly worse. So please bear with me. But I did just want to thank Victoria, actually, first for chairing that panel session and for hosting today. I also wanted to thank our conference partner, ECFMG, whose support has helped to make this event possible today. But mostly, I just wanted to thank all of you, and there are so many of you still here, which is great, for sharing your support and ideas and engagement on how we can support the medical profession to deliver excellent care. And in the room, we still have people who come from many different places. Of course, we've got many doctors in the room. We also have nurses, medical students, educators, government officials, and patient representatives. And of course, as we were reminded just now, we are also all patients. And of course, there are a few of us that are regulators in the room as well. But wherever we come from, I do think we share a common goal. We want to make sure that there are enough healthcare professionals in our workforce. We want to improve the experience of all of those healthcare professionals, whether they're doctors in training, consultants, medical students, wherever they may be. A strong theme from today has been about wanting to focus on, improve and care about the environments in which our healthcare professionals work. We also, at the GMC particularly, want to ensure that our workforce has the skills and support they need to meet the standards that we set to provide excellent care to patients. And a theme that just came out of the discussion just now is that we do want to build a just culture in which learning and candour can go hand in hand. And hence the theme for today, togetherness, which has been many places across the venue today, because I don't think any one organisation can deliver on all of those issues. And actually, this is something that is a joint endeavour, a collective challenge for all of us in the room today. Now, today has generated a huge amount of debate, hopefully debate that we will continue. And I wanted just to start with a couple of reminders of things that Claire mentioned in her speech earlier this morning. Firstly, we need to understand and recognise the context of pressure in the system. The level of pressure is undeniable. And that is an issue across all four countries. We have people here who come from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. Quite often the healthcare debate is very country specific, but as a professional regulator, we look across the UK. And Claire and I have just been on a tour of all of the countries in which we work over the last few weeks. And although the structures and the narrative are different in each of those countries, and the need for us to bespoke what we do is really important in all of those countries, the challenges that we face in terms of that pressure is something that is in common across all of the countries in which we work. And of course that raises questions for governments. Money is not an issue that's within our gift, but we are working very hard to influence and inform thinking in issues like ones around the workforce that we need and how we ensure that workforce can deliver for the patients' needs of the future. It also does reinforce for me the direction of the GMC's strategy. If you forgive the kind of slightly bureaucratic rhetoric, what we're trying to do in the GMC is move from being a reactive to a proactive regulator. We often use the phrase getting upstream. What that really means is that we're trying to invest more of our resources, ultimately the bulk of our resources, in supporting doctors to be great doctors, because we think that is the best way to protect patients. And we don't want to invest all of our resources in acting after the event. At various stages today, both in plenary and other sessions, People rightly raise concerns about the process of a GMC investigation. As Claire mentioned, we get between 8,000 and 10,000 complaints coming into us each year, and we investigate between 2,000 and 3,000 of those. But what we really want to do is to ensure that we can be better at getting upstream, work with responsible officers locally, focus our efforts on improving local clinical governance, because quite often when things come to us, things are often quite complicated, quite difficult to unravel. Often it can feel quite litigious as well. So the more we can do to do that, the better. And one of the things Saffron mentioned just now in the panel conversation was about the richness of the data that we hold at the GMC, and that's absolutely right. When I've been here now for 2.5 years at the GMC, and one of the things I was struck by when I first arrived was quite how much data we have. And I think we're getting increasingly good at extracting the insight and intelligence from that, so it is more actionable. So to give you a couple of examples, we know that doctors who are coming into the UK to work are much more likely to be complained about in their first 2 or 3 years of their practice, not because they're bad doctors, quite often because of issues about understanding issues like confidentiality and consent, which might play out very differently in a UK context than elsewhere. That's why we've laid on our Welcome to UK Practice training, free training for all doctors, and are very ambitious about how many doctors new to UK practice we can get through that programme. That's a really good example of where our data can lead to something very actionable, an action that we are taking. It is perhaps slightly harder to act on the data that I also see through our information, that if you are and I don't know if there are any of these in the audience, so forgive me in advance, but if you're a white, male, 55-year-old GP, you're also more likely to be complained about for different reasons. But me writing a letter to every white, male, 55-year-old GP, I think may not engender the response that one might ideally want. So I think that question about data is really important in driving what we do to get upstream. It also helps us think about how we can join up with others. I wasn't able to attend the session on the Emerging Concerns Protocol, but it's a really good example of how we're working better with other regulators, other system players, to share our intelligence and data, understand how we can collectively act in a slightly more anticipatory way, and in a way where we can address issues before they become really deep-seated and really hard to address. So I think that question of data is really important. But the other area, and I think this does thread through many of the conversations today, is that we are increasingly focused on how do we influence the workplaces that doctors inhabit, the environments. And I think that relates very strongly to many of the things that we talked about today. So I just thought I'd share a couple of my highlights from the day that reinforce that point. Firstly, we had Megan Wright, who I thought was fantastic this morning. And I know from many of you talking to me, that was a very shared view. One of my takeaways from Megan's speech was around listening up, not just speaking up. And I think that's something that all of us need to think about in the context of our own leadership, our own organisations, but also the service as a whole. Megan also talked about the skill involved both in speaking up and listening up, and I think that is also something that we need to reflect on. But in response to, I thought, Ramesh's excellent question to Megan about, well, what about culture change? That, of course, is always quite an elephant in the room, and it is a long game, as Megan said in response to Ramesh, but I think it is something that we must never take our eye off. And of course, that linked to the next session I went to, which was Henrietta's session on speaking up. Aside from the really kind of simple but arresting point about actually the power of saying thank you when somebody speaks up, which is something that we should all take away. The other point that I thought was fascinating was seeing that correlation between organisations with a good speaking up culture and their rating from the CQC. So that question of culture change, I think, threaded nicely through both of those conversations. I also went to the Unprofessional Behaviours session that Kate and Joe hosted so brilliantly just before lunch. And I'm really delighted today that we've unveiled our pilot in that area. I think it's a really important issue. there was real enthusiasm in the conversations that I was part of in terms of how do we create virtuous cycles rather than vicious cycles in the way in which we think about behaviours. But also that really important point that when we're talking about unprofessional behaviours, we're not just talking about those extreme examples of unprofessionalism that we can all cite, but it's those passive and those passive-aggressive behaviours that are perhaps slightly harder to pick up and address. And I also detected a huge enthusiasm about how do we embed this in a deeper way, which I think is terrific, together with a sense of how do we do that in a sensible and proportionate way. So equipping individuals with the skills to speak up and tackle unprofessional behaviours without also attending to the wider organisational culture and governance within which that can happen is something that we need to be very careful about. I should also probably admit that I had an interesting role play in that session where I think I was cast as the villain and the chief executive of the Nursing and Midwifery Council was the person giving me my feedback, which was a very chastening experience, I can tell you. And then I did also just want to reflect a little bit on the health and disability session I attended just after lunch, which I thought was firstly a technological triumph. We had people participating by video link from Boston and from the Gold Coast in Australia, which I thought was fantastic. And I really felt that the stories that we were told, Kelly Lockwood's still here, were incredibly humbling, but also inspiring. And I think that was one of the most powerful things I will take away from our time today. So let me finish with just a few thank yous. Firstly, again, thank you to Victoria for so expertly chairing and hosting the day today. Thank you all for such stimulating conversation and engagement. I do get a sense of real energy and a shared sense of commitment. And I'd really encourage everyone in this room to think about how they can continue those conversations beyond today. And thank you in advance for that continuing commitment, because I think we have to take that forward together. But finally, can I just thank all of the people who've made today such a great success? There have been a number of people, too many to name check, in the GMC who've been part of the organisation for today, for hosting sessions. And I know there are many friends of the GMC who've also taken part in sessions as well. So could you finish by joining me in applauding all of them? Thank you. Thank you very much. You may depart. Thank you.